So many of these classics that I read aloud with my kindergartner were stories that I myself was reading for the very first time. We had so much fun reading these together. I definitely underestimated her ability to understand certain stories, and I am so surprised by the top 3 books that she picked out of all of these. So I'm excited to share. Hello friends, and welcome to my channel. My name is Haley. I am a Christian wife, homeschooling mother of 3, out to redeem my very own literary education. Which means usually I'm talking about the books that I'm reading, but I'm starting to share a little bit more of our homeschool and especially the literary life of my children, because I do not want them to have to redeem their literary education. I really want reading and literature to be a very important part of their life because it is a very important part of mine. And like I said in the intro of this video, so many of these books I just now read for the first time as an adult. So if you've never read them, don't feel bad. You can read them alongside of your child. And what I learned is that I've definitely been underestimating my daughter's ability to understand certain stories, because some of these I found on book lists, and then some of these were just children's classics that I wanted to read, and I invited her to read them along with me, not really sure if she would get them or not. But all of these are chapter books. So these do not include picture books. These don't include poetry or nursery rhymes or any of our Bible stories or story treasuries. These are strictly chapter books. And I started reading chapter books with her at the very end of her preschool year and that summer going into kindergarten. If my daughter went to public school, she would be considered an older student because her birthday happens right after that cutoff date to be able to enter into kindergarten. So she was 5 when we started read-alouds and turned 6 in the fall of her kindergarten year. So that's kind of where she is developmentally, and I do think that matters when you're approaching stories with your children and maybe even deciding where to cut off at a point in a read-aloud. Because some of these books, the chapters were a bit long and I would have to cut them into 2 or 3 parts to be able to hold her attention. But I'm just going to dive right in. I'm going to share these in no specific order and then share with you my daughter's 3 favorite books that we've read out of all of these at the end. So the very first chapter book read aloud I introduced was The Adventures of Pinocchio by Carlo Collodi. Now this is an abridged version of the story, meaning that it's not word for word what the real classic is. It is slightly brought down to an easier reading level. However, it's still pretty close to the original, and we loved this one. The second we finished this book, she asked if we could read it again, which is a telltale sign that this was a great story. I thought Pinocchio was so funny, and I thought he was just very childlike. If you're a parent and you read Pinocchio, you're like, yeah, that's exactly what a kid would do. And it was hilarious, and we loved it. The next story we read was Peter Pan by J.M. Barrie. She loved this story, and so did I. I did read this when I was a kid, probably not until middle school though, but this book came out a ton in her play outside. She was in Neverland, they were pirates, it was wonderful. So this was fun to experience with my kindergartner because I wasn't sure if this would be right for her age or not, but it was, and we loved it. The next book we read is an absolute classic for a kindergartner, and it's a great place to start if you're not sure where to start with early chapter books, and that is Charlotte's Web by E.B. White. This is another book that I was read to in my childhood, and it was so precious to be able to re-encounter this story with my own daughter. It's a sweet story about a pig who befriends a spider and learns that humility and kindness is really the most important thing of all. And I thought it was so sweet and touching, and she really enjoyed it. The next book we read was Little House in the Big Woods by Laura Ingalls Wilder. This was my very first time reading the Little House on the Prairie stories, and we loved it, which is kind of funny because a lot of this book just talks about how they lived life in this time period, and you think it would be boring to a child, but it's really not. So your child is enjoying a history story, learning something, but also getting some really great literature, and I myself learned a ton about how they lived in this time. She loved this book so much that she listened to it on audiobook at least 3 times since we've read this story, and this summer we plan on reading the next book in the series, and I can't wait, and neither can she. The next read aloud we read was Sarah Plain and Tall by Patricia McLaughlin, and this story was so touching to me as a mother. Basically, these children live out west. They lost their mother to death, and their father writes to the other side of the country to find himself a wife. And when she comes, they're just hoping and praying that she will stay because they just love her. And it was a very sweet story. It's very short, very emotional, but so good. I think I enjoyed this one maybe more than she did, but I'm still glad we read it together because it kind of had topics of discussion that she's never really encountered before. So it was a really sweet story. I particularly really loved it. The next books we read were a blast from my childhood past, and that is Junie B. Jones by Barbara Park. We've read the first 2 books in this series, Junie B. Jones and the Stupid Smelly Bus, and Junie B. Jones and a Little Monkey Business. Now, these were the very first books I can remember reading as a child, so it was fun to read them aloud to my daughter. However, I realized that Junie B. Jones has really bad behavior. She is kind of a sassy kindergartner, and the stories are really funny, but her behavior's not great. So she's not exactly a wonderful role model. However, because she's so kind of ridiculous, my kindergartner had no problems pointing out, Mom, she is really bad. But we both belly laughed at the stories. I do have a few more of these books that I think I will read to her since she can recognize that Junie B. Jones should not be doing some of the things that she's doing. But they're hilarious, they were fun, and we would read these in one sitting on a rainy day or a sick day. So these books were really great for that. The next book we read was The 100 Dresses by Eleanor Estes, and this book was really emotional. It's about a girl who kind of lies and says she has 100 dresses in her closet because she's getting picked on when really she's poor and doesn't have a lot of money. So it has some really great conversations about bullying and honesty and just being kind to people, and it was such a sweet story. The ending kind of ends at Christmas time, so you could read this book around Christmas time, but you don't have to. But my daughter really enjoyed this one as well. The next book we read is also a really great Christmas story, and that is The Velveteen Rabbit by Margery Williams. This book was so precious about a toy who becomes real and is loved by a child, and it was just adorable and kind of makes you see your children's toys just a little bit differently, but it was a really sweet Christmas story that we had a lot of fun reading. The next book we read was The Year of Miss Agnes by Kirkpatrick Hill. Now, this book might have been a little bit old for her since she really hasn't experienced a ton of schooling yet. It is about a teacher who teaches in a remote village in Alaska, and these students have really kind of been left behind by previous teachers, but Miss Agnes breathes life into their school in what I would argue is a very kind of Charlotte Mason way, and I loved it. As a homeschool mom, I got a ton of inspiration from Miss Agnes. And also, my grandmother is an Alaskan native who grew up in Alaska, so learning about their Alaskan village life was particularly special to me and my daughter, as that's a part of our cultural heritage. But we really enjoyed this one, but this probably could have been saved for maybe like 1st or 2nd grade, but I'm still glad we read it, and since I have more children, we will encounter it again. The next book we read was Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle by Betty MacDonald, and we loved this book. It is so hilarious. Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle is the neighborhood lady who just befriends all of the children and teaches their parents cures on how to help them work through things that their children are struggling with. things like not sharing and saying everything is mine, 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 and being stingy, or things like not wanting to go to bed. And her cures are hilarious, and I have actually taken some of her advice as a parent and reenacted this with my daughter when necessary, and it was very fun. I know there are a couple more books in the Mrs. Piggle-Wiggle series, and we're definitely going to read them because we just both laughed out loud and loved it. The next book that I have is actually our most recent read, and it's from the library, and that is Meet Felicity. And this is one of those American Girl books. And I used to read these as a kid, and this is the first one that I've read aloud with my daughter. My library has them all, and it was so fun and sweet. In this one, there is a young girl named Felicity who lives in colonial America and befriends a horse who is owned by a not-so-nice man. And she finds a way to befriend and free the horse, and it was very sweet and fun, while also getting a small glimpse into history. The next books I have, I feel like were maybe a little bit elevated for my daughter as a kindergartner. However, I was reading them myself because I'm redeeming my very own literary education. I'm reading a ton of classics I've never touched before, and I just asked her if she wanted to read them with me, and she said yes, and we did. And I am so surprised by how much she loved these books. And the first one is The Princess and the Goblin by George MacDonald. This is a classic fairy tale. Even the language is a bit elevated, but she still loved it, and so do I. It just had that old-time fairy tale feel, and it was lovely. It's about a little girl who befriends a boy named Curdy, who is working in the coal mines and finds that the goblins have this plot to steal the young princess, and it's just really charming and lovely. And I love George MacDonald. I would like to read more by him, and this is a book that's come up a ton in her play. Anytime that she sees fishing line, she thinks of the magic string that the magic grandmother had, and it's just beautiful. This one lives in her imagination, as it should. The next book we read was Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll. This was also my first time reading this book, and she loved this story. This book was really ridiculous and nonsensical, but I think that's why she could enjoy it as a child. She told me the Cheshire Cat was her favorite part. Something about that cat is just magical and grasped her attention. And the Queen of Hearts was also pretty hilariously ridiculous. And so we loved reading this one together, and she surprised me on it. I didn't think she would be ready for this level of story, but she loved it. And the next book we read was The Secret Garden by Frances Hodgson Burnett. This was my first time reading this book, and it is just a favorite now in our family. My daughter and I both loved this story, and this has come up so much in her play, especially outside. I can tell this is a book that changed her, and it changed me. I did a whole video on this book about lessons in motherhood that I learned from reading The Secret Garden, and it was precious. This is a book I would read with my children every single spring. I thought it was going to be a bit over her head. Absolutely not. Now, the chapters are kind of long in this one, and I did have to break them down either in half or in thirds, but it was fine. So it took us a little bit longer to read it, but it was still worth it. The very last books we've read together were, of course, Winnie the Pooh, and I do think these are perfect for kindergarten read-alouds. Pooh is just so silly. All of his animals are so fun, and this was also books that my younger children would listen to as well. So this one I broke out at the breakfast table because it was one that my 3-year-old would listen to and that my almost 2-year-old would kind of look at the illustrations with every now and then. But this is a treasury, so it has the 2 Winnie the Pooh books. So those are Winnie the Pooh and the House at Pooh Corner. And it also has the poetry books written by A.A. Milne as well, which are ones we're reading through right now. So out of all of those early kindergarten read aloud books, which 3 were my daughter's top 3 favorites? This shocked me and also didn't shock me when she told me. Her very favorite of all of them was Little House in the Big Woods. It shocked me because, like I said, it's kind of a lot of history and not so much a story, but we read this book and she listened to it several times on audio, so I can't wait to go through the rest of this series with her because I'm also reading it for the very first time. The next book that was her favorite was The Princess and the Goblin by George MacDonald. This one shocked me because the language was very elevated, even for me. However, that fairy tale magic in this story just gripped her, and it comes up in her imagination and her play all the time. So for that reason, it didn't shock me. But I thought this would be over her head, so don't underestimate your child. And last but not least was Alice's Adventures in Wonderland by Lewis Carroll, another book that I thought was a bit above her level to understand. Nope, she loved it. Now, I struggled with this one just a little bit because of how nonsensical it was, but when I read it, and I did a whole video on it just with my personal review, it really does bring back that logic of childhood and that reason of childhood and helps you capture that silly imagination. So I can see why she enjoyed it. But these were her favorites, and so I've learned certainly not to shy away from the classics with my daughter, no matter how young she is. Now, like I said, these were not the picture books we read or the story treasuries or the poetry or nursery rhymes. These were only the chapter books. And I would read these mainly at night before bed. I would read the littles because I have a 3-year-old and a just now 2-year-old. I would read them a picture book first, and then I would spend time reading the chapter book with her because they would not listen. They were not into that. They would just play while I read this aloud to her specifically. But it was so much fun. So many of these books I've read for the first time. We have 2 more kids, so we will certainly be rereading them, reintroducing them, and I'm excited to see what these books will have for her the second time around in a different stage of life. Because some of these I think would have been a better fit with her a little bit older. So while all of these may not be the perfect kindergarten chapter books that you should read with your child, they are the early chapter books that I did read with my kindergartner, and she enjoyed it, and so do I. I cannot express how much fun reading aloud is to your children. It just creates a special bond and a really good way to end the day on a good note, especially if you had a hard day with your child, which does sometimes happen. So I love this. I highly encourage you not to underestimate your children when it comes to their read-alouds, to just let it be, let it happen naturally, and if something's not working, just drop it and put it down. There were several chapter books that she wasn't interested in that I had checked out from the library, and if she didn't like them, I just stopped. We just stopped, didn't worry about it, and moved on to something else, something she would engage in. So try to find the books that are the best fit for your child where they're at right now. And if you're looking for some books to learn a little bit more about reading aloud, I highly encourage the Read Aloud Family, written by Sarah Mackenzie. I love that book. And then The Enchanted Hour. I'm not sure who the author of that book is, but I will put it up on the screen and in the description below. Thank you all so much for watching. Please share with me in the comments below some of your favorite read aloud books with your children, because I cannot wait to keep reading with my child. Lord willing, I will see y'all next time. Happy reading, friends.